anyone that wasn't able to be here today but would like to see this webinar, that recorded version will be available the week following the webinar, and you can pass that information along to them. Following the webinar, we will be inviting you to fill out some quick feedback polls that will just give us an idea of how we can improve our webinar experience going forward, and just an opportunity to hear from you. So once we sign off, you'll be taken to a screen with those polls. Finally, Rob and Ross have made available the PowerPoint presentation that you'll be seeing today. So if you'd like to download a copy of that, you may do so by clicking where it says Trinity PowerPoint in the Files pod. The Files pod is in the right-hand column of your screen, so simply click that, highlight it, and download it through your computer. And you can do that at any time. So we have Rob with us today, who teaches historical and systematic theology at Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax, and Ross with us, who's now the lead minister at West Vancouver United Church in British Columbia. We know that both of them are involved in many different things, and that they've co-authored the book Grace in the Trinity together. I've never led a webinar with both my presenters from opposite ends of the country like this, so that's kind of a neat experience, and I know that many of you are from different parts of our country as well. So we look forward to hearing from them. I'm going to sign off. I'll still be here in the background. If you have a technical concern, feel free to type that into the chat pod, and I'll do my best to respond. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Josephine.
Thanks, Josephine. Folks, we're just really glad to have you here today with us. And if you haven't yet taken the opportunity to write your location in the little chat box in the corner of your screen, why don't you do that, just so we have a sense of where everyone's from. In some senses, I'm really quite sad that we can't hear your voices and hear your responses as we go along. That can certainly make a livelier group discussion. But I guess in this particular format, it means that you have to kind of put up with my voice and Ross's voice for the time being anyway. And of course, feel free to exclaim things in the privacy of your own location. If you want to write anything down in the chat box, we'd be glad to see it as well. One of the fun things about the, here are some locations now. Thank you very much. Sarnia and Vancouver and Elora and Red Deer. One of the fun things about this particular software and its format is that you can add things down in that little chat box, but you can also have little side conversations with individuals if you want to send pass a note in class kind of thing. That's fun. When I'm on the webinar, when I'm not talking as a participant, I really do enjoy having the opportunity to do that. Everyone can hear me still okay? Can I get an okay if you can hear me? Okay, thank you very much. So if we just have a look at the PowerPoint, what we wanted to do today was to walk you through some of the process that Ross and I went through to develop the book that we co-edited. There are about 20 contributors to this book from across the country. All are persons in ministry in the United Church of Canada. And where we began with this project, which is called 3 Ways of Grace and was published by United Church Publishing House in 2010, we began kind of with some reflections and conversations just between the two of us on what we might call the lost language of the Trinity. Ross and I have been friends for a long time. We grew up in the same church, Sturgeon Creek United Church in Winnipeg. In the west side of Winnipeg. That was our neighborhood and our community, and we grew up going to Sunday school and youth group there, and it's been a number of years that we've known each other, so we've always had some great conversations, some of which have been foolish nonsense, but many have been also trying to plumb the depths of some of the theological realities of our church. So if you hear all of that today, don't be surprised, because we kind of go back and forth between those two extremes. So as I say, we were talking about this kind of reality that we were noticing within our denomination of the lost language of the Trinity. And one of the ways we wanted to kind of open that conversation with you before we kind of go into the backstory here was to ask if you could reflect on your experience of Trinitarian language in congregations. And it may be that you can pop some things there into the text box, the chat box at the bottom, or it might be just something you want to think about for a couple of minutes. In our congregational lives, and we're not thinking particularly of what we might have learned in confirmation class or theological school or anything like that, but when you actually are in the midst of the Trinitarian or into the congregational life, where and when do we hear Trinitarian language? I see Mel's putting up a note about baptism and benedictions. That's one place it shows up. Um, the particular language of the Trinity often shows up in our hymn tradition, of course, especially in older hymns. When Doug Peck makes coffee and fries. Oh no, that's not Trinitarian language. Okay. That's about his Happy Meal. It needs the burger. Pat is talking about seeing them in creeds. Dan's got a note here coming. Oh, maybe not anymore. In any case, there's some places like that that we see Trinitarian language come through either in the past or in our current experience. But when we thought about what has happened to Trinitarian language in our denomination, one of the things we reflected on was the impact of inclusive language. And I want to be clear that I'm not trying to cast aspersions on the advent of inclusive language, because I'm actually quite a big fan of it. And I think it's important for us to balance our understandings of God and how we approach God in our language. So inclusive language in itself isn't, so to speak, a problem or something to fault. But we have noticed that as inclusive language has come more and more into our denomination, there has been a temptation not only to set aside Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as a Trinitarian formula, but to set aside all language of the Trinity, because folks haven't really pursued alternative language or some other possibilities. Warner's noting here, prayer is not necessarily overtly referred to in regards relationship, right? Wendy, not a lot of knowledge and expression, creeds, hymns, sacraments. Okay, thanks. And then another factor that seems to be contributing to the lost language or the losing of the language of the Trinity is some misgivings among many of us in the United Church about Christology. And of course, if you understand the person of Jesus Christ to be not divine or less than divine or somehow outside the divine reality, or in no way different from any other human being in terms of participation in the divine reality, that does start to impact and maybe impinge upon how we understand the Trinity. And so, of course, how we speak of the Trinity in terms of our language also starts to modify and shift. So whether we call those misgivings or shifts or transitions or however we might frame that up, there has been quite a lot of ferment and excitement and work done in Christology in the last 30 or 40 years, and that also starts to impact what we do with the Trinity. And then related to that, of course, are Unitarian influences, and this is a small u. It's not meant to speak about the uppercase U Unitarian denomination, but those influences and trends within our theological discourse and understandings within the United Church of Canada, which tend away from a Trinitarian or a triune understanding of God towards a Unitarian understanding of God. So, of course, that impacts how we understand the person of Jesus Christ, but also how we speak about the Holy Spirit or the first person of the Trinity, all those places where we normally had in years past spoken in triune or Trinitarian terms. Now there's more and more language of just God or Holy One or Holy Mystery, kind of an undifferentiated unity, and the language of the Trinity gets set aside. So those are some things that we were just kind of mulling over, and I've done a little bit more exegesis on those three than I kind of intended to do, but those three were on our minds a little bit. Ross, do you want to say anything at this point?
Yeah, from my perspective, the Unitarian influence is one of the strongest ones that I've just observed in congregational life. I know when I was working in Bay of Quinte conference and looking at the final interviews for ordination and so forth, a helpful question often was asked of candidates, God, the Maker, Creator, Father, Mother, whatever language they wanted to use around that, Jesus Christ, Holy Spirit. Which one of those three areas would you use the most language and why? And I found that really interesting to hear people's responses. And the language of God in a general sense was the most common. And it was in the particularity of Jesus that a lot of people stumbled or struggled. And so I think, in our conversations together, Rob, in your pastoral background and now teaching at the university, and my background in pastoral ministry and now teaching a bit at VST here, balancing those two, right, church and academy, and how Christians live out this unique doctrine that really defines us as a people of faith. That in a shocking way just seem to be put on the shelf in so many United Church gatherings. Like I would often sit, this is kind of a sick pleasure, it's like counting ceiling tiles, the number of holes in the roof, but I would attend various United Church functions, whether presbytery or conference or national, and just keep a little tally of the number of times that Jesus was mentioned. And you could sometimes go through worship services and everything else, and the big J never appeared. And so there was that sense in which conversation flowed more easily.
Yeah, so those are some of kind of the experiential things that we were encountering, and I guess we still encounter. And of course, as Trinitarian believers ourselves, that's proved to be concerning or vexing in some ways. And I guess the deeper I got into understanding the Christian tradition across national boundaries and across history, of course, for most Christians, Trinitarian language and a triune understanding of God is still normative and has historically been normative. So we just started to wonder kind of what's been going on in our denomination. And one of the ways I like to think about the Trinity is that it's the distinctive way in which Christians understand God. There are, of course, a variety of ways to understand the divine, to understand God around the world and through different traditions and religions. But for Christians, it's the distinctive thing that makes us understand for ourselves what we mean when we speak of God. So to see this kind of vanishing or eroding in some ways was concerning for us. So I guess we have just a little poll to ask you to fill in. It should pop up on your screen here in a minute. And the poll just is to see if any of what we've been talking about resonates with your experience.
I love the poll, Rob.
You love the poll. There's no poll to see if you love. You love the poll.
I want to do this when we preach.
Yeah, instant polls. There's clickers in the classroom. You can use clickers too. You like what Reverend Ross is wearing today very much, a little sometimes.
Dress to bless the Lord, brother. Dress to bless the Lord.
So a few people filling in the poll. Thanks for that. Josephine, I hear your typewriter, or your keyboard, so maybe if you could mute your mic, that'd be cool. Greg's noticing in the Pentecostal churches, they just shout out, Amen. So the next poll is, does any of this matter? The kind of phenomenon that we're talking about in the diminishment of the use of Trinitarian language, and of course understandings of God as triune that accompanies that. Does that matter? That's the second poll for us to consider just at the bottom.
You see Nancy's comments about the congregation seems to be embarrassed at naming
Right.
Jesus.
Yeah, that would be a curious thing to pursue a little bit. Whether it's, I mean, embarrassment for sure, but also awkwardness. And I mean, in some ways, the New Testament talks about Jesus as a stumbling block as well. So how is it that we experience Jesus as a stumbling block for us today? That might be something interesting to pursue, but that'll be another day, another webinar. Warner's noticing that people shy away from a lot of Jesus language out of concern for being offensive or aggressive. Yeah. Okay, so thanks. I mean, keep those remarks coming. We're just going to keep moving along, though, so we don't lose our time too much. So out of these conversations, Ross and I were out for a stroll with our spouses and our kids along the lovely Moira River in Belleville, Ontario. There's a picture. At the time, Ross and family were living in Belleville, and the family used to stop there overnight on our way through quite often and have a bit of a visit. We went down to the river for a walk one day, and this notion kind of came to us that we ought to do some writing about these questions and approach it in some way. So that's where the notion kind of was birthed, was here along the banks of the river. And the next question became, how would we respond? And we thought that writing was something that we feel comfortable doing, and it was, I guess, in the days before a lot of webinars and podcasts, and YouTube still seemed kind of cheesy and something you might do in your basement. So we thought we'd write, and then we thought, should we just go ahead and write something together or on our own or with friends? And it became pretty clear pretty quickly that we wanted to engage some other voices and not just rattle off on our own. So that's the two of us in earlier, younger days, actually not that very long ago. And then some of the people that we approached, and you can see in the table of contents for 3 Ways of Grace who all these people are. That table of contents is available on the UCRD website, just to pop open anytime if you don't have a copy of the book. So as I say, we engaged about 20 or so of our friends and colleagues to write for the book. And among the people we asked, everyone said yes immediately, except for one person who I believe was ill at the time. So the fact that people responded so quickly and so readily and so easily indicated to us that there was some hunger or desire or readiness to engage these questions. So we started to pull together the project, and as I said, that's kind of how it turned out with UCRD UCPH a couple of years ago. And we had kind of 3 goals with 3 Ways of Grace, 3 goals that we wanted to put through and into the project without being terribly doctrinaire or explicit about it. This was kind of the personal goals we brought to the project. So the first was to reintroduce Trinitarian thought and language as a resource for the contemporary church, and intentionally that, to be a resource. Obviously, it's been a resource for hundreds and hundreds of years, but we felt in this era of kind of slippage or loss of some of that language and understanding, we wanted to reintroduce it in a fairly gentle way. Like, we didn't want to hammer people over the head or have a great big long dogmatics that we thought everyone ought to read, but to take a pretty approachable stance and just reintroduce that language as a resource to say, here's something we might all access. And then secondly, to think through the implications of Trinitarian thought and language for the Christian life and the life of the gathered and dispersed community. So what does it mean to be engaged in Trinitarian thought? What does it mean to use Trinitarian language when we actually live out our discipleship, when we actually live out the life together as God's people in communities and beyond our communities? That was something we thought was rather important to address. It wasn't just an Ivory Tower experience or Ivory Tower project. it wasn't just about splitting hairs over homoousios, but really to say, what does this look like on the ground? How does this hit the road? And then thirdly, to provide devotional and study materials for individuals and groups that reflect Trinitarian spirituality. I think there's still quite a lot of this kind of thing around in our historic United Church documents. There's quite a lot of this around in other traditions in terms of contemporary publications, but we weren't seeing a lot of it in contemporary work from the United Church. So we said, what kind of devotional and study materials can we just get out there, again, in a fairly accessible way? We wanted the book to be really the kind of thing that any kind of educated lay person might pick up. Basically, really not really looking for much more than a high school education. Just someone who could pick it up and read it, kind of like the newspaper, and engage with some of these ideas and concepts. But not just on the level of ideas and concepts again, but on the level of living it out. What does this look like? What does this mean? And then to put that into the context of devotional work. So some people have really embraced the book as a devotional work. The chapters, there's 24 chapters, they're pretty short. It's the kind of thing you might pick up and read for a few minutes and then set aside and get on with your day. One of the wonderful things I think about the book is it's more like 24 postcards than it is a long argument. So if you don't like one chapter, you just skip to the next one and you have a completely different perspective to engage with. You can also read it from back to front or front to back or start in the middle or hop around, and it doesn't make too much difference in terms of how you receive the book. I think that drove the publisher a little bit crazy because there was no story arc from beginning, middle to end, but we did find that putting it together in that way made sense to us. So Ross was going to pick it up here with some of the things that we included in the introduction.
Thanks, Rob, very much for that. And it really, in many ways, is a fascinating project because it began in conversation. As Rob mentioned, we have a great love for each other and just love life together. And there was something really Trinitarian about that, right? If we know God as 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, and we're invited into the life of God through our baptism, then there is something about the joy of life together, and we wanted to share that. And so when it came to the introduction, we wanted to make clear to the reader where we were coming from as editors. So we thought it might be helpful, whether you've had a chance to read the book or not, just to share a little bit from the introduction. So here's what we came up with. The Holy Trinity, God's own triune self, is integral to the core convictions of the Christian way. It is well rooted not only in the shared ancient creeds and liturgies of our partners in other Christian churches, but also foundational to the United Church of Canada's traditions. From our basis of union drafted in 1908 to the contemporary Song of Faith in the 2000s, Trinity language and Trinitarian theology have been essential to our understanding as people of faith and to the expressions of our faith. And I'll just flip over here. As a Christian denomination, we in the United Church have said many times over the decades, from before the time of union in 25 and well into this 21st century, that knowing and relating to God as Trinity is still important and helpful to us. And Christians all over the world in a huge range of cultures continue to find the Trinity the best possible way to speak of a profound reality that is, in the end, beyond words alone. When we reconnect our personal lives of faith to the historic and contemporary expressions of faith that are lifted up in the wider Christian community, we are profoundly enriched and spiritually nourished. We grow in faith and love as we find ourselves within a story and in relation to patterns of belief that our church, and indeed the whole international church, has loved for generations. Trinity language is the language of relationship, dynamism, community, and transformation. It tries to express the inexpressible. It invites those who hunger for God to feast on a richness of images, connections, and love. I think, it's interesting that, I'll finish this part of the introduction and let's say some comments. We affirm the decision made by the United Church of Canada's 1986 General Council to use a variety of human and other metaphors, images, and pronouns for God and church documents, worship, and liturgy. In other words, we embrace the spirit and purpose of the General Council's declaration that we should strive to use a variety of images, terms, symbols, and names for God. The height and depth and breadth of the reality of God is endlessly rich and wonderful. As the Theology and Faith Committee reported to that same General Council, God is more than what we humanly can see, speak, or understand. Trinity language strives to speak of the heart of God's nature as loving relationship. All human language for the ultimate reality of God, the Trinity, is only approximate. We only come close to describing and naming God appropriately. All of our language is partial, and in some ways it is always inadequate. All of us are seeking faithful and just ways to speak of the holy. As a denomination committed to inclusive language and to the Trinity, the quest continues. So that gives you a little overview of the heart that we brought to this project. And I see, as Josephine notes here, the PowerPoint, all this is available for download. I've been curious about the impact of the book on the denomination. And, I often wonder whether a book as popular as The Shack may have done more for a variety of images and understanding of the Trinity. I had lunch with the author of The Shack recently. It's through a connection here in Vancouver. When he comes to town, I usually get together with Paul Young. Had an infamous episode up in Whistler where we stayed up till 3 a.m. drinking scotch and talking about the Trinity together, some of which I remember. And, I said to Paul, do you realize what you've done for a lot of us in the mainline Protestant church and the Trinity? And he was a bit surprised by that. And he said, well, I usually just get flack from the more conservative or fundamentalist churches in America over the rich imagery of the Trinity that I use. And if you haven't read The Shack, he uses the image of a large African-American woman nicknamed Papa as God the Father / Mother. Jesus is, I guess you could say, as people might expect him to look, a Middle Eastern carpenter. And the Holy Spirit is depicted as kind of a here again, off again Asian woman, and it's such rich imagery. And Paul was surprised. He said, well, it's hard for me to imagine Christians who wouldn't have the Trinity as a central core conviction. And I thought, wow, we have drifted in the UCC when it becomes an optional understanding rather than the primary lens through which we see God. And so I think The Shack in some ways has been a very helpful book to help people reimagine God. Again, that commitment to inclusive language, but without throwing baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So I just wanted to share a couple of samples of the variety of understanding of the Trinity that we have in our book. And maybe the most helpful place to start is our buddy Andy O'Neill, who's out on the East Coast in a beautiful maritime conference. And Andy says in his chapter, which is entitled Seeking Community in a Digital Age, Andy goes to his usual go-to theologian, Paul Tillich. And he writes, Theologian Paul Tillich once explained that God as Trinity is not a matter of grammar or mathematics, but as a result of the human experience of God. Every biblical story is a story about an experience of God's revelation. As Christians, we locate our experience of God primarily in the person of Jesus, who promised that God's Spirit would always be with us. This presents us with no small challenge to say a single word, God, actually refers to a whole host of different experiences and realities. Yet in an age when ardent atheism finds it seductively easy to use this word God to refer to an easily graspable abstraction, I find the challenge of Trinitarian language pleasantly defiant. I love that, what Andy has to say. And I think we found in the invitation to folks who are contributors to write on the Trinity through the lens of the work that you're doing in the United Church of Canada. I'm not sure Rob and I could have imagined the great diversity. We knew that there would be folks coming from different places, but that it was all together through the lens of our Trinitarian God was a pretty awesome thing to see as the essays started to fly in from the different contributors. We have a great article that opens this work from Peter Short, someone who has been a great inspiration to many of us in his time as moderator, and he writes simply a little letter to God on prayer through the Trinitarian lens, and that's a really special gift that he gives us. And then Anthony Bailey, if you want an example of a completely different perspective, Anthony in Ottawa writes a long poem to God, in which he begins imagining God as a divine grandmother. He says, "It reminds me of a divine grandmother, apron at the ready, loving and gentle, though firmly and unmistakably in charge. Table prepared and accessible, with room for everyone, and then even more room. Bread and fruit and drink, and mercy." And well, you get the point. And then Anthony closes, he goes through this beautiful series of images on the heavenly banquet. And then he concludes by saying, "All is ready, let the feast begin. The Father, Son, and Holy Ghost makes judgment on those who hoard the most, and chooses to suffer whatever the cost, to save and heal those who are lost." So this great variety of images and stories that folks have contributed. When I was sitting down, I wrote one chapter entitled "Two Good Ways to End a Cocktail Party Conversation," which was a reflection on Trinity and evangelism, and how talking about either of those is a great way to have people become quite uncomfortable in a cocktail party situation. But I wanted to also root in my writing in another chapter entitled "An Accidental Pilgrimage." I wanted to root our understanding of Trinity in everyday life. And so if you'll permit me, I'm just going to read a little piece that I wrote with my wife Laura that gives you a sense of how Trinity can just kind of drop into the midst of ordinary day. Toward the end of a disappointing cool summer, our family jumped at the chance to spend a rare, warm, and delightful mid-August day outdoors. Driving a short distance from our friend's 19th century parsonage in rural Connecticut, where we were trading preaching duties for a free vacation spot, we found ourselves by the end of the afternoon seeking refuge from the day's heat in the leafy shelter of the New Haven Green, the heart of Yale's Ivy League campus. The Green, a beautiful park-like setting, is home to three distinctive New England-style churches, two Congregationalist and one Episcopalian. Our children, Emily and Jack, as preachers' kids, have developed the charming habit of asking us who the minister is of this church or that church in our travels, and if at all possible, wanting to go in and check the place out. The starting point before we hit the nursery and the Sunday school is often the sanctuary. So on this humid afternoon, somewhat weary from the heat, we climbed the steps into the Episcopal Church and slipped into a rear pew. It was blessedly cool and the worship space was empty, save for an organist practicing a few pieces. "Where's the preacher? And what's she going to preach, Dad?" my daughter Emily demanded in a voice slightly louder than necessary. "I'm hungry, Mum," bellowed Jack. Great. The Lockharts had arrived. The organist, only partially visible at the front, continued playing and appeared to stay focused despite the rowdy Canadian invasion. Shifting her weight uneasily on the hard wooden pew, Emily asked another question. "What's that window at the front?" Preoccupied by our children's unruly behavior and the sprinkling of fishy crackers on the floor, we had not noticed the breathtaking stained glass window above the altar. The afternoon sun shone brightly through the rose window, offering a rich theological image of the Trinity. Within the circular window, the three persons of the Trinity were depicted and named in Latin: Pater, Filius, and Spiritus Sanctus. "What does that window mean, Daddy?" Emily tugged at our sleeves. "I'm still hungry," chimed in Jack. "Well, that's a stained glass image of the Trinity," I replied, aware that we were on the verge of an awkward parent-child theological conversation. "The what?" Emily said. "You know," I stammered, "God as Father or Creator or Maker, and Jesus and the Holy Spirit." A light of recognition crossed Emily's face. Her best friend back home in Sunday school, Leanne, often arranged her stuffed animals at home like children's time on a Sunday morning, playing the part of the preacher. Leanne was famous for invoking to her friends, teddy bears, and anyone who had listened the name of the Trinity: God, Jesus, and Dora the Explorer. At least she didn't replace the Holy Spirit with Boots the monkey, we used to assure her mother. "Right," Emily replied. "Father, Son, Spirit." Her little hand reached out and traced the three-person rose window in the distance. The best part of the window was still to come, though. Around the outside were the words non est, meaning is not. In other words, the window's words struggled to clarify that the Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father. And yet, completing the theological mystery was the word Deus, God, at the center of the circle, and est, meaning is, linking the three persons of the Trinity to the word God. While the three persons are not the same, they are all God. Try explaining that to a child. I share that story only because I think in my experience of United Church congregations now from the East Coast to the West Coast, a lot of the struggle with embracing God as Trinity comes from this hesitation, whether it's Sunday school teachers, folks in Bible study, elders on the board, with the sense that they have to fully understand the Trinity in order to speak in Trinitarian words or terms, rather than acknowledging it as the unique Christian legacy in the wake of God's revelation that we have in Jesus. It's our ability to not just make sense, but to fully embrace God as we know God in Jesus through the Spirit's power. And I think each of the chapters of the book takes that very seriously. We obviously invited folks who we knew were deep in a Trinitarian lens, but we were hoping for a great diversity, and indeed that's how we got it. We did structure the book in a particular way. I'm going to pass it back to Rob in order to give you a sense.
So I think it took a little bit of time to think through how we wanted to structure it. Of course, everything has to come in threes if you're a Trinitarian. So the first way is kind of focused around personal spirituality. Who am I when I'm alone with God? And those are the first 8 chapters. Again, the chapters are quite short. The second way, to share in community, reflects on the practices and experience of the gathered body of Christ, the gathered congregation. When we're together, what's it like for us in worship, in preaching, in music, and so on. And the third way, to live in the world God loves, looks outwardly. So what does it mean to be engaging with Trinitarian understandings and language in the wider world, when it hits the ground in terms of our mission, our outreach, our discipleship, beyond the walls of the church? What does that look like? So there is meant to be that kind of progression from the inward to the communal and then to the wider world. And not simply to get stuck into our own private piety, nor to get stuck in kind of an outward orientation that neglects the internal life, the inner spiritual life, but in some way to have those three in balance. Maybe the word progression isn't quite the right word there. Ross has just run through some highlights there. I don't think I have anything to add right now, and despite the way this is come across in some ways, this isn't really meant to be a commercial for the book. We're just trying to engage some of the ideas and experiences we had in putting it together, and inviting our friends and colleagues to participate in the project. So I think if we can spend the last, well, we have just under 20 minutes or so, if we spend the next 15 minutes or so thinking about how this kind of material, these kinds of questions impacts, enriches, expands, especially the life of congregations, we'd be very, very keen to hear from you as participants where this hits the road. How does it impact preaching or not? Does it matter in our preaching? What do you wish for in a preacher? What would you like to hear? Or where does it show up in worship? Or where is it disappearing in worship? And what is to be done there? Or is that a problem? In pastoral care, in teaching, in all ages, children, youth, and adults, in the prayer life of our congregations, or indeed in our personal prayer life. So if there's some things there that might tweak your imagination and interest, we'd really like to spend the next few minutes hearing from you. If there are comments or questions you'd like to pop into the text box there. I know there was one a few moments ago about progressives, I guess arising from Greg's experience in the book club or the book group, looking at the shack. And of course, you know, progressive is a pretty tricky word. We are often associating it with the Canadian Centre for Progressive Christianity, which is kind of in some ways, I'd say a stepchild of the American Progressive Christianity group. I would really encourage you to look at the two faith statements or set of theological claims that the two groups make. The Progressive Christianity group in the US and the Progressive Christianity group in Canada are actually quite different, and putting them side by side, it's a very worthwhile thing to do. Of course, progressivism is part of our United Church history and has always been so, partly because of our social witness, partly because of our embrace of liberal theology from the earliest days. So I'm a bit reluctant to kind of cast people in camps to say, oh, well, they're the progressives, or they're the orthodox, they're the liberals, they're the conservatives. I find we're all just such a strange, quirky mix of all that stuff that it's not particularly helpful to lump people together in that way anymore. At least I feel incredibly strange in terms of the ways in which I pull some of that stuff together, and I think maybe that's just me. Maybe that confuses other people, but to label someone, put them in a box at this point isn't going to be particularly helpful. How a group of persons, for instance, who embrace progressive Christianity, however that's framed, and how they would engage with the shack, I mean, that's, again, I think there's a whole range of things that people might respond with.
I think I'll jump in on Ryan's question from beautiful VST across the water on preaching and how it can enhance preaching. You know, I love living here in BC. I'm a prairie kid and lived back east for a long time before that. But out here on the West Coast, I've never lived in a place, Ryan, as we live, where people are so comfortable with the concept of spirituality and so uncomfortable with a particular expression of faith. And yet, for me, there's a sense in which I think preaching clarifies, right? There's like in a United Church way, it clarifies our tradition. It's like I love engaging atheists. Atheists are some of my favorite people to talk to, especially if you're ever stuck on a plane on a long overseas flight. I always love when people say, "What do you do?" Because I think, oh, that's an opening for the gospel. So I usually just say I'm a pastor. Sometimes I say I'm an evangelist just to get people worked up. And I remember sitting on a flight to Toronto last year, and the guy said, really? He said, do people still believe that stuff about Jesus? And I said, yeah, actually it means everything. And he said, well, I don't believe in God. And I don't know how you as pastoral leaders respond to that. My usual response is simply to say, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in, and sit quietly for a few minutes. And almost every time when someone has finished explaining the God they don't believe in, I can say, as a follower of Jesus, deep in my heart, I don't believe in that God either. There are a lot of small g gods floating around in our culture. I think the Bible just calls them idols. But there's that sense in which preaching through a Trinitarian lens, I would say, clarifies for fuzzy congregants who are living and breathing and swimming in this culture of relativism, who Jesus is in light of God's Spirit at work in the world. So I think preaching is a great opportunity to clarify the doctrines, without saying, well, I'm going to talk to you about the Trinity today, right? Like, I think there's a reason why most preachers give away Trinity Sunday, right? They don't want to touch it. But I think, just like John Wesley said, every Sunday is a little Easter. I think every Sunday is an opportunity to dive into the mystery of the Trinity.
I'm just seeing Mel reflect on she says the delicious tension in seeking to live out the relational beauty of the Trinity within congregational boards. That's a beautiful statement in itself, Mel. And I mean, that's the place where we see the power of the Trinity, because the Trinity is about relationality, about mutuality, about the embrace of love, about continuing to stay in the struggle, not neglecting one another, not giving up on each other. And when we deepen our discipleship understanding of our relationship with God, we see that the Trinity actually models the way in which God draws us into the divine life, that we aren't left to our own devices or radically alienated from God. So take all of that over to the chaos and craziness of a church board meeting. I mean, that's a beautiful moment to imagine that in that moment, God does not abandon us, nor will I abandon those people who are driving me crazy, nor will I abandon those with whom I don't agree, but we'll stay in relationship. We'll stay in the tensive, loving, mutual relationship that God has modeled for us in the Trinity, and we also will commit to be together and not leave each other. That's a fantastic place in which I hope that we can live this out as in congregational boards, committees, anywhere where there's that kind of strain or tension. And then, of course, in the happy times, then it's the celebratory, perichoretic dancing and singing that we talk about for the Trinity's life together as well. Warner's got it.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I think that the loveliest story that I heard recently for the Trinity, I was using this in preaching, was from Baxter Kruger, an American theologian with a lovely southern drawl. And I was just telling the most charming story of sitting on a Sunday afternoon and watching Sunday afternoon football and reading his newspaper. And then all of a sudden, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a little ninja appear. And it was his son, all dressed up. Those of us who have little kids, how they get all dressed up and they sneak around. And he knew what his son was going to do. His son was going to just jump up and attack him, right? And they're going to play wrestle and all that good stuff. So he just kept reading his newspaper, watching Sunday sports, pretending like he didn't know the kid was there. And then all of a sudden, of course, he gets jumped on, and they wrestle for a few minutes. And Baxter said, but it was weird because he realized for a minute, oh, it's not just his son. There were two little boys wrestling him. And what was that? And then he realized, oh, his son has got a play date. There's another kid from the neighborhood over. And he thought, geez, I hope that kid's parents know that he's over here at our house playing. Kids wrestle for a couple minutes and then they run off. And in the middle of that moment, Baxter said it was almost like a ticker tape went across his forehead from God saying, pay attention. This is important. And after the kids had run off and newspaper was strewn all over the floor, he sat there and he thought about how fascinating that moment was, because he expected his son just to, jump up and wrestle, and there's nothing more natural than that between a parent and a child. But he said how fascinating it was that that little boy that was over for a play date joined in, because if that little boy had walked in on his friend's dad watching Sunday football without his little friend there, he would have never jumped up and wrestled the dad. That would have been so strange. But because he went into the room with his friend, and the friend jumped up first, and it was such a loving, playful relationship, the little friend who was over was invited into that. And Kruger uses that as just such a beautiful example that because of the love between Father and Son and Spirit, we're invited into that, right? We are invited into the inner life of God as disciples, and that sense of belonging to a loving community is at the core.
That'll preach. I noticed Paul was talking about the atonement as well, and I mean that's another place we could have a long conversation about whatever happened to the atonement in the United Church of Canada. And it may be that atonement language is out of fashion. It may be that atonement understandings are out of fashion. And I certainly met lots of people for whom even the concept of the atonement is just so objectionable and problematic that they have just completely erased it from the hard drives of their faith. And I can't quarrel with the reality and integrity of a person's individual faith, but there is still within the Christian tradition some account of how God deals with sin. How does God address the problem of sin and the relational problem that sin creates? This, I think it's, maybe Ross, you can help me, but the fellow Doug Paget says this isn't a legal problem for God. Sin isn't a legal problem for God, but a relational problem. It's not that we've somehow got ourselves into hock in the courts of heaven, but that we've actually ruptured relationships. So how is it that God does something about sin? How does God become impatient with the alienation and unreconciliation that sin creates? Well, you can't even have that conversation if you're not prepared to deal with some understanding of the atonement. And absolutely, as Paul noted, this is where the Trinity comes to our aid again. The Trinity who copes with and deals with the realities of sin and finds a solution. There are all kinds of models of the atonement which we might want to work through and walk through, but simply not to deal with it at all, I think actually leaves the problem of sin unreconciled. So I think this is a huge issue for pastoral care, for example, persons struggling with their own sense of sin and trouble. It's obviously going to be a problem during Holy Week, Good Friday, Easter, all through those Lenten texts, through the apocalyptic texts. Anywhere where God confronts the reality of sin and does something about it, we have to kind of erase or skip over those bits of the Christian tradition if we're not going to deal with that at all.
It reminds me of Barbara Brown Taylor's great book, Speaking of Sin, The Lost Language of Salvation, where she just so clearly names the fact that mainline Protestants have missed the boat in the sense that if we stop talking about sin, the folks who sit before us in the pews every Sunday are still experiencing alienation in their relationships every day. But now
And not to belabor the idea that people are wandering around oppressed by the weight of their own sin, as Wesley thought we all ought to be all the time, or Augustine for that matter. But I mean, there is the reality that in many of our liturgies we just never deal with the heartache and trouble that people are experiencing, and we like to think that in our pastoral care we can do that. But in public worship, I think it's worthwhile to address that too. Certainly, the public worship of God's people in the generations gone by through the Judeo-Christian tradition put that front and center. that those are the realities either that we bring upon ourselves through our sin, or that the sin of others has caused for us. And to imagine that God doesn't respond to that at all, I think is a real shame, a real gap in our understanding. Just looking back at the comments again. Warner again saying that something other than substitutionary atonement is an important thing to put in front of people. For sure, for sure. The healing of our wounds, yeah. Or the word for salvation is soteria, so the thing that ought to run right. When a former parishioner of mine was talking about traveling in Israel, I guess the bus broke down and they couldn't get it to work. So the driver, who was also the mechanic and also the tour guide, got off the bus and fiddled with it, fiddled with it, fiddled with it. And finally, on this hot Israeli day, he got the motor running again, and he said, soteria. I guess that was in Greece, not Israel, sorry. But the idea that the machine was running as it was supposed to, soteria, healing, completeness, wholeness. It really is about the fulfillment of human life as it's meant to be lived, not just some kind of a lot of blood all over the floor kind of sacrifice, but really the renewal and the healing of the human life. That'll preach, says Doug Peck.
That'll preach. I mean, there's that whole sense of, I think in our culture today, in the Canadian culture, speaking in terms of salvation as wholeness, body, mind, spirit, that whole sense, at least that works here on the West Coast with our love of yoga, that sense in which Christian faith is a lived discipline, not just a theory to reside on the bookshelf. That it's daily practice, and I think that maybe is something we haven't touched on yet to much of a degree. But the role of prayer in the Trinity. I mentioned Peter Short's article in the book, but that sense of encouraging church members as they pray to do so, whether it's a breath prayer. To invoke the name of the Trinity in prayer is one way to ground. And we all have heard those stories of the Celtic Christians that would get up in the morning and shave in the name of the Trinity, or
just as we're kind of in between things, I want to pass on that Greg Braun, who's one of our participants today, is saying that there's a conference coming up through the Crucifusion group, which is focused on all things Trinitarian. So he just sent me the link there, crucifusion.ca, if you'd like to attend the conference. I understand it's also pretty much dirt cheap for a national conference, and it's coming up in early April. So have a look at the website there. So the remainder of our slides. Well, I guess we've already been into this, comments and questions. Maybe if there's, we're almost out of time, I guess. Let me just say very quickly what's next. The kinds of things that we have in mind for what would happen beyond this conversation. We're not going to be putting out another book on the Trinity anytime soon. See Elisa, I see she's on her way. But these kinds of things, to continue to maintain and express a robust Christology, to continue to explore the Christian past for a usable tradition. That's Rosemary Radford Ruther's phrase, actually. Continuing to query Unitarian trajectories, continue to develop liturgical materials that address honestly and creatively the need for inclusive language. So those are just some of the trajectories we might be following, or any of us might be following. Ross and I are also about to launch a new blog, again with lots and lots of guest contributors. So posting things about once a week. We're going to launch that on Easter Monday. So if you want to learn more about that, give us a shout and we'll get you connected with the website when it's up and running Easter Monday. There's our contact information. Again, this whole PowerPoint is available to download, and I think the whole thing was recorded, which could be somewhat of a disaster to look back at later for me. Kathy Morgan is typing at the moment. Well, I got to say, Kathy Morgan's typing. Kathy Morgan was our teacher
I was going to say,
back in school back in the day. So thanks for joining us, Kathy. Headshots. Yeah. Yeah. I think we got to give it back to Josephine. Everybody for being here with us today. It's been a blast, and look forward to lots of continuing
Well, thank you
conversation
everyone so much
and
for
your critiques and
participating.
your
I just
thoughts
want to
and
do a quick
rebuttals. I'm
sound
sorry we're
check.
out of time.
Sometimes when I come back on, I have a little bit of trouble. You can hear me, Rob, Ross? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this discussion today on your book and the importance of having the Trinity as a central part of our worship, pastoral care, and all the aspects of our ministry. So I certainly will have that book on my must-read list as well, so thank you. And thanks to all of our participants today for participating. Just a few reminders for you. Greg has mentioned that the Crucifusion Conference coming up in April will be dealing with some of these themes, so please do check out the link to that website. Also, next week we have a webinar with Norm Tasevsky, who's part of an initiative called Venture Delhi, and he will be sharing with us on social entrepreneurship and how that relates to new innovations in ministry in the church environment. Finally, as Rob and Ross mentioned, this webinar has been recorded. You will receive the link to the recording next week sometime, so feel free to pass that along to those you think who might want to watch it. And I'm going to let Rob and Ross sign off, and as soon as they've done that, I will transfer you to the feedback polls and ask that you would just take a minute to fill that out. We are sorry to be a bit short on time. I know perhaps some of you still have some comments and questions, and hopefully you can be in touch with Rob and Ross. So thanks again, and Rob and Ross, I'll